And okay, thanks, Leila. So there's various solutions available, and so there's bilateral solutions, as some of you may know. They're quite popular. I take it in the Low Countries at the moment, maybe. There's multiple conclusions solutions, and there's solutions requiring a principle of compositionality that can be justified on grounds of learnability, and Bonnet and Westerthal have appealed to such a principle. So there are solutions available, and we could adopt one of them off the shelf. But that's not what we're going to do, because we think we have something interesting to say, hopefully, about Carnap's categoricity problem. And philosophically, all of these solutions, they require some departure from the sort of standard way of formalizing logic, multiple conclusions, bilateralist framework. We also do something that's not entirely orthodox, but we think that we're a bit closer to orthodoxy. So we have single conclusion, and the formalization will be assertion based. So we are really giving two talks in one. So one on propositional logic and one on first and second order logic and the determinacy of mathematical theories. So, introduction. So just to rehearse things that are very well known. What's Carnap's categoricity problem? That's essentially the problem is that you can show that the rules for the connectives, for the classical connectives, don't determine categorically their interpretation, except the rule for conjunction. But you know, that's a pretty meager consolation. So consider the trivial valuation V star, that's going to come back later, makes every sentence true, so it doesn't provide any counterexample, validates, it doesn't invalidate any of the rules, but it makes phi and its negation true. And you would have thought that it's part of the meaning of negation that the sentence and its negation are incompatible, so the meaning of negation is not fully determined by the rules, by standard natural deduction system. So the argument goes, you have analogous problems with, for disjunction, the conditional. I mean, this is well known. And then there's a second indeterminacy argument that's also very familiar. So assume a standard reference-based conception of truth and meaning, a very orthodox stuff. And then you can argue that our best mathematical theory T can determine the interpretation of the mathematical vocabulary because of various theorems. For instance, the Löwenheim's column shows that T has models of every infinite cardinality if it has a model. And you can say, the point here philosophically, you can say, well, T captures our use of the mathematical vocabulary. That's our best mathematical theory. And if our use of the mathematical vocabulary doesn't determine its interpretation, what can? So that's Putnam's essentially argument. So, of course, this. So far, we assume that this theory T is first order, but as we know, things change if T is second order. Then you can show that T can be categorical or quasi-categorical. So should we adopt second order versions of our mathematical theories? But of course, the problem here becomes, well, these categoricity results or quasi-categoricity results are only available if we give the second order quantifiers their full interpretation. But they could be equally interpreted by the Hankin semantics. That's essentially a first order interpretation that doesn't yield categoricity or quasi-categoricities. And the problem is that the rules for the second order quantifiers are not categorical, that seemingly. They are compatible with both kinds of semantics. So we haven't really solved the problem. So there's a skeptical upshot here. You have two options. So either we have to ditch the sort of reference-based conception of truth and meaning, the orthodox conception, And that's something that Putnam gestures at, and then you have Button and Walsh and many others who say, well, we should adopt some kind of inferentialist framework, some deflationary understanding of truth conditional semantics. Anyway, it's not very orthodox. Or you just embrace indeterminacy, like Hamkins, I think, is in this frame of mind, and you say, well, there's lots of interpretation, we welcome them all, they're useful, they're great, and it's a sad world when you only have one interpretation, say, of set theory up to a certain rank and so on and so forth. But we live in Salzburg. We work and live in Salzburg, so we are duty-bound by contract to be orthodox and conservative, so we shall defend orthodoxy. You guys live in liberal, in the Netherlands. Here it's ganz anders. It's a bit different. So that's what we're gonna do. So we want to play by sort of fair means. So we want to adopt naturalist metasemantics. So we accept Putnam's point that if our use of the language doesn't determine its interpretation, then what can? The problem is how to understand our use of the language, really. So we assume a broadly inferentialist metasemantics, on which interpretation of a logical or mathematical expression is determined by our dispositions to infer according to the basic rules for E. If E is a logical expression, then the basic rules are the standard introduction and the elimination rules, sequence style, that's going to be important. And if E is a mathematical expression, we'll take these basic rules to be just the second order theory to which E belongs. So PA2, ZFC2, and so on. So what we claim is that given an adequate understanding of what a schematic rule is, the rules for the second order quantifiers determine the full semantics for second order logic. And we reason in two steps. So first, we offer a solution to Carnap's problem for propositional logic, first order logic, and then second order logic. And then we invoke, as we said, the categoricity of second order logic to provide a higher order response to Putnam's indeterminacy argument, to the model theoretic argument, as it applies to mathematical theories. We're not talking about the language in general. Of course, this idea is not new. It's been around for a long time. So McGee has been pushing it, and others, Levine and Parsons. But our strategy is different, and we're going to say why in a moment. So our main result, so our starting point is a theorem from 2016 to the effect that first order logic is categorical. So by Bonnet and Westerthal, they show that the rules for first order logic uniquely determine the interpretation of the connective and of the first order quantifiers. This is what got us started here. But I mean, this is very nice, but Bonnet and Westerthal make two brute force assumptions. So they assume that any admissible valuation V has the following features. It's not trivial, so they rule out V star X like by definition. It's compositional, so these two things are going to just brutally solve Carnap's problem for propositional logic almost immediately. And then they assume that interpretation of the quantifiers is permutation invariant in V, so invariant under arbitrary bijections of V's domain, and that's going to give you the sort of the unrestricted, the standard interpretation of the first order quantifiers. So the first thing we proved was that this result generalizes to second order logic and to the logic of finite order. So given these three assumptions, the rules for the second order quantifiers determine the full semantics for second order logic. But the problem is that, as we said, we want to adopt a naturalist metasemantics. So we need to justify any assumption that we make with respect to our use of the language. And these assumptions here are quite controversial. They're not quite in keeping with our meta-semantics. We want to argue that these assumptions, actually, they're not necessary. They can be discharged. We argue that the right kind of rules, they guarantee non-triviality and permutation invariance. So non-triviality just comes from the structure of the consequence relation that you can have the empty set in the conclusion. That's how we interpret absurdity. That's also very familiar. So there's no mystery here. Permutation invariance, we get this from open-endedness, and this is, of course, more contentious. We eliminate the appeal to compositionality essentially by presenting our own solution to Carnap's problem. So that's the talk in the talk, basically. Notice, though, that compositionality is the least controversial of Bonnet and Westerthal's assumptions. I mean, it can be justified on grounds of learnability. So if it turns out that our proposed solution to Carnap's problem for propositional logic doesn't work, then that need not damage our overall goal of providing or giving an account of the determinacy of second-order quantifiers and higher-order mathematical theories. So a caveat before I hand over to Brett. So Putnam argued in various places that model theoretic argument that there was no answer that the realist could give, because essentially he said, well, if whenever you try to give a metasemantics for your language, that metasemantics can be reinterpreted. It's just more theory, so it cannot secure by itself the correct interpretation of the language. And Tim Button, in a number of publications, has defended this move. I never really quite understood what Tim thinks here. We also discussed it. I mean, so here there's a standard reply that many people have given. So U is the locus classicus here. So of course we should be allowed to give the correct metasemantics for E. And of course, if it's correct, it's just going to do its job. And of course, it can be interpretable in lots of different ways, but this doesn't mean that the account is incorrect if it is. So we're going to see an instance of this dialectic at the very end if there is time. But so that was the introduction. So I leave it to Brett to sort of present the difficult material in the middle, and then I'll go back to the more gentle objections and replies at the end. So, Brett.
Thanks. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Should you unshare?
I'm gonna unshare. Stop share. Yes.
Okay. So, right, so we're going to start with talking about the determinacy of logic. In particular, we're going to start with Carnap's problem for propositional logic. And again, we need to show that we can solve that problem in a naturalistically respectable way without assuming compositionality and without just assuming by fiat that an admissible interpretation cannot be the trivial interpretation. So in order to do that, we're going to start with thinking about what it means to say that our rules are valid. So we have three conceptions of validity. This sort of way of thinking about things is taken from James Garson's book, What Logics Mean. So we have three possible accounts of what the validity of a deductive rule might consist in. It could be the preservation of truth, obviously. It could be the preservation of sequence satisfaction. This is called local validity, or it could be the preservation of sequence validity, which is called global validity. The first one applies to rules whose inputs and outputs are sentences, of course, but we already know that Carnap's problem is not really escapable if you have rules formulated in terms of sentences. So we're going to look at 2 and 3, which apply to rules whose inputs and outputs are sequenced, so meta rules. So just start with a definition. The satisfaction of a sequence by evaluation is just that the evaluation satisfies the sequence if either the evaluation makes one of the things on the left false, or it makes the thing on the right true. And so given that definition, we can define local and global validity as follows. A meta rule, that's the general form of a meta rule, is locally valid with respect to a class of valuations if it preserves sequence satisfaction in that class. So if in every valuation in that class, if the valuation satisfies all of the premise sequence, it satisfies the conclusion sequence as well. And global validity is a kind of a stranger notion, but basically, rather than preserving sequence satisfaction, it preserves sequence validity. So if every valuation in the class satisfies all the premise sequence, then every valuation satisfies the conclusion sequence. So we are fans of local validity. That's what we're going to defend. Garson rejects the local conception for reasons we'll get to in a second, but we think that the local conception is actually really helpful. And one of the reasons it's helpful is that we can use it to get the determinacy of propositional logic. And Garson proves this theorem that the rules of classical propositional logic are locally valid with respect to a class of valuations only if all of the members of the class obey the classical truth table. So that just gives us the result we want. And yeah, so why does Garson reject this local conception of validity? Well, he has 2 reasons, and the first of them has to do with the fact that classical rules are not separable. So, for instance, the conditional rules determine the standard classical truth table for the conditional. That means they validate Peirce's law, but Peirce's law is not derivable from just the conditional rules and the structural rules. And Garson thinks that this is like a strange mismatch between the deductive role of the connective and the meaning of the connective, and that's a problem. If you find that to be a problem, we can solve it. But let's set that aside for a second. Oh, let's not. Okay, so all right. So the answer we have to this is that Julien has recently published a paper called Classical Harmony and Separability. I believe that's what it's called. And he gives a harmonious, separable axiomatization of classical logic on which Peirce's law is derivable from the conditional rules and the structural rules alone. For details, you can look at Julien's paper or the material in our paper. But the things that are important for us here are just, it is a fact that on this axiomatization, the rules are separable. So you don't get this incompleteness issue. There's also a side benefit, which is that since Julien's axiomatization interprets bottom as the empty set, following Neil Tennant, Ian Rumfitt, William Steinberger, negation elimination turns out to rule out the trivial valuation. So negation elimination just forces any valuation to have at least one false sentence. So we've now discharged assumption 1, right? Just by using this axiomatization, right? So that was one of the 3 semantic assumptions. We're discharging it here. Okay, so what is the other reason? Arguably, the more important reason that that Garson thinks this local conception of validity is no good. Well, he thinks that there are counterexamples to the standard interpretation of the quantifiers given this local conception. So standard formulations of the rules of first order logic turn out not to be satisfaction preserving on the standard interpretation of the quantifiers. If that's true, it's pretty bad. So let's look at an example. So here's a standard formulation of the universal introduction rule. And what Garson says, and correctly, is that evaluation that satisfies the top, the premise sequence need not satisfy the conclusion sequence, even when the term T does not appear anywhere in gamma or in phi. Here's like a quick example that makes it very obvious that this is the case. Right? If T is a term that denotes Paris, then the sequence that has nothing on the left and T is a city on the right is going to be satisfied, because Paris is a city. But, and the rule says that from that you should be able to infer for all X, X is a city, but that's obviously not satisfied. So, so this is a problem, and something similar happens with existential elimination. But what I want to point out here is that when we were looking at this objection, we had a correspondence with Garson, and we sort of realized that like the problem is that we're using a name as a variable, right? It's an eigenvariable. Formally, it's a name. We're using it as a variable. It's supposed to be schematic, but formally that's not captured. And the reason that doesn't matter in normal logical practice is that whenever we use the standard universal introduction rule, we're using it in the course of a proof. And the side constraints that, T can't appear in phi or gamma are sufficient to ensure that if we have a proof of gamma then phi T, then T, it doesn't matter what T is, right? You can insert any name there and you'll get the same proof. So because this happens only, because this appears only in proofs, it doesn't matter that T is, in fact, formally speaking, a constant rather than a variable. But we want to be able to use these rules outside of proofs and just in general reasoning in everyday life. So, we should take seriously the idea that this is a variable and use this alternative, also standard interpretation, but not that interpretation of the universal introduction rule, which says from phi you can infer for all X phi as long as X doesn't appear free in gamma on the left there. So basically we've eliminated this. We've basically turned the eigenvariable into an actual variable. That's all it's done. And so if we take this rule as our rule, then Garson's objection becomes that evaluation that satisfies the argument gamma yields phi need not satisfy gamma yields for all X phi even when X is missing from gamma. And that's not true. So if he were to try to advance this version of the objection, he would just be making a mistake. That objection would rest on a mistaken understanding of what it is for evaluation to satisfy a sequence that has a free variable in it. Okay, so right, we're now allowing arbitrary formulae to occur in sequence rather than just sentences. So we need to sort of go back and redefine sequence satisfaction and stuff like that to make sure that everything's general enough. So this is what it looks like. You need to first define sequence satisfaction relative to a variable assignment. So where S is a variable assignment, evaluation satisfies a sequence relative to that variable assignment if and only if in that evaluation either the assignment fails to satisfy something in gamma or it does satisfy phi. And of course, then you can just say, well, now we can just say evaluation satisfies gamma yields phi if and only if it satisfies sub f relative to the variable assignment s, gamma yields phi for every variable assignment s. So you'll note that this generalized definition just gives the previous version of sequence satisfaction, of the definition of sequence satisfaction as a special case when everything is a sentence. So all it does is just generalize so that we can talk about when an open formula, a sequence containing open formula is satisfied. Okay, and then local validity looks exactly the same as before, except now it's defined in terms of our new version of our new notion of sequence satisfaction rather than our previous less general one. So a meta inference is locally valid with respect to a class of evaluations, just in case it preserves sequence satisfaction for all valuations in the class. That is, if and only if either the premise sequence are not all satisfied or the conclusion sequence. Okay, so that's definitions. And once we have that, we can sort of go back and look at Garson's objection and see what happens. So the initial version of the objection was that even if T doesn't occur in gamma, gamma yields T as a city can be satisfied even though gamma yield for all x is a city is not satisfied. That's obviously true, but that's not an instance of the rule anymore, given the way that we've reformulated the universal introduction rule. You can't infer for all x is a city from T as a city anymore. So the inference from T as a city to for all x T as a city, that's an instance of the rule now, but obviously that doesn't yield any counterexample to the local exception of validity, so that's not a problem. So if Garson's objection is to like be the objection he wants it to be, it would have to be that gamma yield x as a city can be satisfied while gamma yield for all x as a city is not satisfied. But that claim is pretty obviously false. So let's just assume that gamma is empty, so we don't have to worry about it. Then x as a city isn't satisfied. It's satisfied on certain variable assignments, like one where the one that assigns the city of Paris to x, but it's definitely not satisfied if the assignment assigns my left shoelace to x, for instance. So no problem here. So yeah, Garson's counterexample to the local validity just cannot arise if you sort of take seriously the idea that the eigenvariable is a variable and treat it as such. And again, similarly for existential elimination. Okay, so that answers everything about propositional logic in according to us, right? We think if you go in for the local validity account and Julien's axiomatization of classical propositional logic, then you solve Carnap's problem without appeal to either compositionality or ruling out the trivial valuation by fiat. So, so that ends that portion of our two talks. That ends that talk. Okay, so let's look at now first and second order logic. Okay, so yeah, assume that we're correct, that we've solved Carnap's problem for propositional logic, and let's see what happens when we try to look at first order logic, or just the quantifiers in general. So what we want to show is this. We'll call it the first order thesis. The rules of first order logic are locally valid with respect to a class of valuations only if all the valuations in the class obey the standard interpretation of the universal quantifier. That is, for any phi with at most x free, for all x phi is true in a valuation, just in case every object in the domain is in the extension of phi in that valuation. So yeah, the extension of phi is M, where M is the domain. And of course, we're just going to talk about the universal quantifier for the rest of the talk, because we're just assuming you define the existential quantifier in terms of the universal. Okay, so the problem here is that we cannot yet prove the first order thesis, not with the resources that we've been relying on up to this point. What local validity of the quantifier rules does not allow us to rule out some possibilities that we need to rule out, namely that the variables in our language range only over a proper subset of the domain. So it's possible, given all the resources we have up to this point, it remains possible that there's some object in the domain that it never gets assigned to a variable. And if there's such an object, then evaluation can satisfy sub s phi for every variable assigned in s, even if the object is not in the extension of phi, because it, you know, yeah, because because there's a, yeah, because x is, yeah, because basically for anything that x gets assigned, it's going to be assigned something that's in the range of x, and this object is outside of the range of x, right? So, so that means that the local validity of for all introduction is going to guarantee that for all x phi is true in the evaluation, despite there being an object that's not in the extension of phi. So we can prove that the following weakened version of this thesis is true, that the rules of first order logic are locally valid with respect to a class of valuations only if every valuation in the class is such that for any phi, for all x phi is true in V, just in case the range of x is a subset of the extension of phi. So we're not going to go through the proof, but basically what local validity guarantees is that the range of the universal quantifier is a subset of the domain. In particular, it's the subset containing exactly those objects over which the variables range. Okay. So the question is, how do you get from that to the first order thesis? So we have the weakened first order thesis, which guarantees that the range of the universal quantifier is a subset of the domain. And the first order thesis says that the range of the quantifier is the domain. So how do you get from one to the other? And the answer is that Bonnet and Westerstahl prove that permutation invariance entails the determinacy of the first order quantifiers. In particular, they prove something that is exactly what we need to get from the weakened first order thesis to the first order thesis. So what's important is at the very bottom here. If the range of the universal quantifier is some subset of the domain, that range has to be the domain itself. So what they prove is on the assumption that the interpretation of the universal quantifier is permutation invariant, then if the range of the universal quantifier is a subset of the domain, the range of the quantifier has to be the domain itself. So that's the theorem that they prove. And it's very obvious that it's immediately a corollary of that theorem, that if we have a guarantee that the range of the universal quantifier is permutation invariant, then the weakened first order thesis just entails the first order thesis. So so that's how we get the first order thesis in our paper. And the question is, of course, what justifies the assumption of permutation invariance, right? In Bonnet and Westerstahl's paper, they just take it as it's like a semantic assumption. We would like to justify it in inferentialist, naturalist-friendly terms. So the answer for us is that we accept that the first order rules are open-ended, meaning that they're valid not only within the language as it currently stands, but that they'll remain valid no matter how the language is enriched. So this is how McGee describes open-endedness. We think that the first order rules are open-ended in this way, and we think that our dispositions to reason in accordance with them sort of gives us this kind of open-endedness. So to be more precise about all that, first we define open-endedness as follows: a rule that's valid in a language is open-ended if it remains valid in every expansion of that language. And we claim that our own first order rules, the rules of first order logic, are open-ended. And the reason we think that that's true is that when we enrich our language, our doing so does not disturb our disposition to accept instances of logical rules. So when we add new words to our language, we don't have to go back and check and think, oh, should I still use the universal introduction rule? we just continue using it. Right. So, right. So in particular, we're going to rely on the following two assumptions. I'll read the bottom one first because it's actually, basically the one that I just mentioned. We're disposed to infer according to the open-ended rules of first-order logic. And then the more sort of substantial one is this thing that we're calling McGee's rule following Peterson and Rossberg. And it says basically that if you have a model of our language, then the following things hold. If you have an object that's in the domain of that model, then there's going to be some language expanding our current language in which there is a term whose reference is that object. And similarly, for any collection, so any set or set of sets or anything like that, that's sort of made up of the stuff in the model, there's going to be some language expanding our language in which there's an open formula whose extension is that collection. So that's the really sort of substantial premise we're relying on here in our proof. And I just want to note, I'm saying it's a substantial premise, and it is, but you might interpret it in a way where it sounds question begging, and I want to make sure that you understand that we're not begging the question here. At least we don't think we are, and because one way of understanding McGee's rule, which is a way that Julien will talk more about in the objections and replies section, is as a metasemantic thesis to the effect that all of these relevant expansions of L are languages that we have some feasible way of coming to speak. And we are not we're not relying on that kind of interpretation. So our argument does not require that we have some feasible way of adding new terms to our language so that these terms will determinately name any objects or sets or whatever. Because if we were making that assumption, we would be obviously begging the question, because what that issue here is precisely whether we can determinately refer to the natural numbers, for instance. So so we're not interpreting McGee's rule in that way. All we're assuming is that each of these expansions is a language that exists in a logical sense. So it's an abstract semantic system whereby symbols are associated with aspects of the world in Lewis's terms. So it's just these languages are logically possible, not that we have some feasible way of coming to speak them. And we think that as long as you think that these are languages that exist and are logically possible, then the open-ended structure of our inferential dispositions is going to do all the rest of the work for us. It's going to take care of everything else. So, like I said, Julien will come back to this in the objections and replies, but I'll flag that here. So, how do you get? So I'm saying that open-endedness gets us permutation and variance. How do you get it? Well, a corollary of McGee's rule is that if the universal elimination rule is open-ended, the interpretation of the universal quantifier is guaranteed to be permutation and variance. We're not going to go through the proof, but once we have that and we have our corollary to Bonnet and Westerstaal's theorem, that completes the task of showing without appeal to compositionality or an assumption of permutation and variance, or an assumption that the trivial evaluation is not permissible somehow. Without any of those assumptions, we've shown that the first order thesis is true, that the rules of first order logic determine the standard interpretation of the first order universal quantifier. Okay. All right. So once you've got that, it's very simple to move to the second order case and show basically the same thing. So by parallel reasoning, you can show that the second order thesis is true. The rules of second order logic are locally valid with respect to a class of valuations only if all those valuations obey the standard interpretation of the second order universal quantifier. You can prove a weakened second order thesis that basically that says that you get you're guaranteed to get a Henkin semantics. So you can prove that easily, just like you can prove the weakened first order thesis. And then you can prove a second order analog of Bonnet and Westerstol's theorem to the effect that if the interpretation of the second order universal quantifier is guaranteed to be permutation invariant, then the weakened second order thesis entails the second order thesis. And again, the open-endedness of the universal elimination rule guarantees permutation invariance given McGee's rule. So, so just as in the first order case, the rules of second order logic fix the full interpretation of the universal quantifier and the existential quantifier as well, since we're just interdefining them. So, so that is, that's logical determinacy. That's our argument for logical determinacy. And as Julien has mentioned previously, it's very easy once you've got the determinacy of second order logic, particularly with full semantics for second order logic, to get the categoricity of arithmetic and everything else. So, so we've argued that the rules of second order logic determine the genuinely higher order interpretation of the second order universal quantifier. They determine that second order logic is correctly interpreted by the full semantics. And this allows us to use the categorical and quasi-categorical axiomizations of arithmetic and set theory to get our categoricity results. So we already know by Dedekind's categoricity theorem that given the full semantics for second order logic, the axioms of second order piano arithmetic fix up to isomorphism the interpretation of the arithmetical vocabulary. And so if the rules of second order logic do fix the full semantics, as we argue, then we get the categoricity of arithmetic just via our acceptance of PA2. And then similarly, the quasi-categoricity of set theory comes via Zermelo's quasi-categoricity theorem for ZFC2. So as long as we accept ZFC2 and have the full interpretation of second order logic, we get quasi-categoricity for set theory as well. So, okay, so what does this have to do with conventionalism? Well, we think that this is a kind of truth by convention in an attenuated sense that is consistent with sort of the orthodoxy that Julien was talking about earlier. In the case of arithmetic, for instance, our conventions, our dispositions to accept the axioms of PA2 and to reason in accordance with the open-ended rules of second order logic determine the interpretation of the logic of the arithmetical vocabulary, and then a Tarskian notion of truth does the rest. So you get you can thereby settle the truth value of every arithmetical sentence, and then analogously for set theory. So so basically, I mean, this is just inferentialism, right? The way we use all of these terms determines their meanings, and then a Tarskian notion of truth gives us truth values from that, and that's the sense in which these things count as truth by convention. All right, so I'm going to pass it back to Julien now to talk about the objections and replies.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. You are unsharing. I am sharing. Is that the one? Yeah, hopefully. Right. So this sounds all very exciting, might sound, but I mean, you might argue. Field has argued that we are effectively cheating, like Brett mentioned at some point. So here's the objection by Field. That's in the postscript to, I forgot the paper, but that's in Truth and the Absence of Fact, 2001. So he writes, it's a cheat to describe the expansions of the language in terms of their extensions, as McGee's rule bars. And the reason this is a cheat is that it assumes that the predicates in the expanded language have determinate extensions, but it says which they don't if the indeterminist is right about number theory. He's considering arithmetic, but of course this generalizes. So of course, our version, I mean, McGee's rule says that there exist all these expansions of the language in some, they exist somehow. I mean, if we are realists, they exist in some Platonic sense. And they're fully determined. I mean, the interpretation of this language is fully determined. But that's exactly what we're trying to show. So are we not cheating there? And Field elaborates a little bit on why we are cheating. He says we might be cheating. He says if I could add a predicate that by some magic as its determinate extension the genuine natural numbers, then I would be in a position to have determinedly singled out the genuine natural numbers. But Phil says that's a tautology, of course. But if you think that we might someday have such magic at our disposal, you might as well think that magic, that we have it at our disposal now. So are we cheating, like our referee thinks? So our point here is that we're not assuming that we will in the future extend our language and speak future determinate languages. We are trying to make a different point. So we're assuming that if we were to speak those languages, we would keep inferring according to the rules for the first order, the second order quantifiers, and so on. So our dispositions would not be affected. And we take, and that, why is that? Because the rules are fully schematic, so it doesn't matter which language you are speaking. You're just going to keep being, if you are disposed to infer according to the rules, you're going to keep being disposed to inferring to the rules. And so we take this to establish that our current dispositions then rule out that there be a possible interpretation of our language that invalidates the elimination rule for the second order quantifier. And that, as we've seen, we didn't go to the proof, but I mean, one can, it's not very difficult. I mean, that it follows from that the interpretation of the second order quantifier must be permutation invariant. So that's our answer, essentially. I guess we're going to talk about this in discussion. But I mean, the bottom line here is that the dispositions, we keep having the dispositions irrespective of which language we speak, and these languages exist. So we are disposed to infer according to the rules, even if we were to speak those languages. Right. And then there's another objection that we find in print to these kind of ideas. So we've appealed to open-endedness, like many others, and Button and Walsh in the sort of Bible on philosophy of model theory. They say that, well, you know, that's also an illicit move, because what do you mean by open-endedness? You only understand open-endedness if you already have a grasp on full second order quantification. So as we've seen, I mean, what does it mean for a rule to be open-ended? Well, that it keeps being valid in all possible extensions of our language. But then Tim and Sean ask, what do all and possible mean here? And they write, to explain what all possible extensions of our language amounts to, we must already have grasped the semantic notions which are employed in full second order logic. Right. So that's a bit a version of the just more theory maneuver. The locution, all possible extensions of our language, is itself up to interpretation, just more theory, and we cannot use this to secure determinacy. And we think so. We think we can respond to this objection. So it's true that it doesn't help to appeal to our grasp of the locution, all possible extensions of our language, for precisely the reasons that Tim gives. But we don't need to have a grasp of the notion of open-endedness in order to be disposed to infer according to an open-ended rule. So all we need is that the rule be open-ended and that speakers be disposed to accept any instance of it. Speakers don't need to think about possible extensions, all possible extensions of the language. They only need to be disposed to be inferred according to the rule. So patch a button. We don't think that our understanding of the second order quantifiers needs to be grounded in a new mathematical theory that gives rise, and this gives rise to infinite regress. We don't think this argument works. We're actually a bit more worried about the field, at least I am, about the field objection. But that's the end. So thanks for your patience. I see that most of you are still here, if not all of you. So thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.